Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Avery Davis-Roberts, and I'm an Associate Director of the Democracy Program at the Carter Center. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. It's my great honor and privilege as moderator to welcome you to this parallel side event on effective protection from online violence against women in politics that's been organized by the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFEST, in partnership with the Carter Center. I'd also like to acknowledge that this panel discussion is being live streamed, so hello and welcome not only to those of you here in the room with us, but also to those who are joining us online. States with higher levels of women's representation are more likely to design inclusive social protection systems that can narrow gender gaps in poverty rates, enhance women's income security, and provide a lifeline for poor women. However, according to the Interparliamentary Union, only 27.1% of seats in national parliaments were filled by women in 2017-2018. One of the greatest threats inhibiting women's access to these decision-making spaces is violence in exercise of civil and political rights, notably in online spaces. Just as an example, a different IPU study noted that 58.2% of female parliamentarians in Europe that were interviewed had been on the receiving end of online sexist attacks. I should note here, though, that serving in political office is, of course, only one way that women are politically active, and that many women express their political opinion through other words or deeds that also may make them targets of violence against women in politics, or VAWP, as we will be calling it, online and offline. The issue of violence against women in politics, including in online spaces, is increasingly recognized not only by scholars, activists, and practitioners working actively in the field, but by intergovernmental bodies and by states themselves. Echoing the work of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women in her two 2018 thematic reports, the first on online violence against women and the second on violence against women in politics, the UN General Assembly Resolution 148 of December 2018 expressed, and I quote, "deep concern about violence against women and girls in all its different forms and manifestations worldwide, which is under-recognized and underreported, particularly at the community level, and its pervasiveness, which reflects discriminatory norms that reinforce stereotypes and gender inequality and the corresponding impunity and lack of accountability, reiterating the need to intensify efforts to prevent and eliminate all forms of violence against women and girls in the public and private spheres in all regions of the world, and reemphasizing that violence against women and girls violates and impairs their full enjoyment of all human rights." The resolution goes on to express deep concern about all acts of violence, including sexual harassment against women and girls involved in political and public life, including women in leadership positions, journalists and other media workers, and human rights defenders. And, still quoting, recognizes the growing impact of violence against women and girls, including sexual harassment in digital contexts, especially on social media. Its impunity and the lack of preventive measures and remedies underline the need for action by member states, in partnership with relevant stakeholders, and that such violence may include stalking, death threats and threats of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as related trends against women and girls in digital contexts such as trolling, cyberbullying, and other forms of cyber harassment, including unwanted verbal or nonverbal conduct of a sexual nature, with a view to discrediting women and girls and or inciting other violations and abuses against them. This resolution makes clear that there is still a significant gap between standards of the dignity that states have established through the normative framework of international law that human rights should apply to everyone, and the practices of states as they respond or do not respond to violence against women in politics and online violence against women in politics, or VAWP. So what more do we need to know about what violence against women looks like in online contexts? How do we know when violence against women transforms into violence against women in politics? Is that distinction important? How can we, as people who clearly share a common cause, being in this room, get a sense of the scale and scope of violence against women in politics and violence against women in politics in online spaces so that we can determine appropriate responses at the national, regional, and international level? Whose responsibility is it to address online VAWP when you are operating in online spaces where corporations play a large role in defining and responding to inappropriate behavior? What are the repercussions on social protection of violence against women in online spaces? These are just some of the questions that our panelists will begin to address, so let me introduce them. First, we will hear from Dr. Gabrielle Bardal. As Gender Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, Dr. Bardal is responsible for providing strategic leadership and technical assistance to IFEST's work in empowering women's political participation and promoting inclusive governance. Dr. Bardal has experience working on electoral assistance and gender issues in over 35 countries worldwide. Her accomplishments include pioneering the field of violence against women in elections with IFEST and serving in multiple senior-level advisory positions for U.S. and European NGOs and international organizations. She holds degrees from McGill, the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, and the Université de Montréal. Dr. Bardal will provide a more detailed overview of VAWP Online, drawing on IFEST's global programming, particularly their work conducting online sentiment analysis of social media content related to VAWP in Zimbabwe, Sri Lanka, and the Ukraine. Following Dr. Bardal, we will hear from Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur. Dr. Thakur is Research Director at the Web Foundation, where he leads research on broadband affordability, gender equity and internet access and use, and data protection and openness, with an emphasis on low and middle-income countries. He has published over 35 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and policy briefs, among other publications. And Dhanaraj previously held a faculty position in political science at the University of the West Indies. A former Fulbright scholar, he holds a PhD in public policy from the Georgia Institute of Technology in Atlanta, yay, and is a graduate of the London School of Economics and the University of the West Indies. Dr. Thakur will start with a very brief observations from global research at the Web Foundation that looks at the problem of online violence against women from household surveys and the Web Foundation's reviews of national policies and laws, and then we'll go on to highlight examples from research and advocacy done by the Web Foundation partners on the challenges they face in addressing this problem locally. Finally, we will hear from Drs. Yuraj and Barker. Drs. Barker and Yuraj are leading experts concerning issues related to online violence against women, particularly online misogyny and the legal responses to it domestically and internationally. Dr. Olga Yuraj is a senior lecturer at the Open University Law School in the United Kingdom, and her research focuses on international law, human rights, and legal responses to violence against women, specializing in feminist perspectives on law in these areas. Dr. Kim Barker is based at Stirling Law School at the University of Stirling. Dr. Barker's research focuses on internet and intellectual property law. Her research explores the regulation and control of online multi-user platforms, including online environments, particularly online games and social media sites, and the intersection between user responsibility, platform provider responsibility, and legal regulations. Their research together explores a number of aspects of online text-based abuse, including consideration of online misogyny and online violence against women as a hate crime, as well as legal regulation of online abuse that has been cited by Parliament, and its significance has also been highlighted by NGOs. Today, their remarks will outline the legal framework around these issues, offering a critique of the gaps within it through examples of violence against women in politics from the UK, the EU, and elsewhere. And they will also provide suggestions of how reforms should be shaped to address the phenomenon and offer some recommendations. I will apologize at the outset because our time together this afternoon is a little bit limited, and so I will be relying on my colleagues to keep their remarks to about 5 to 7, maybe 10 minutes each, so that we have some time for questions at the end. And so with that, I will turn over to Gabrielle.
All right. Thank you so much, Avery, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I know it's been a big day for many of you attending all of the excellent events here at CSW. So as Avery said, it's been less than 6 months since the issue of violence against women in politics has been recognized internationally as a human rights violation, and since all member states of the United Nations have been called upon to do something about it. So this is a fresh topic. It's a new topic that has gone from an issue that was basically unrecognized and a daily fact of life about a decade ago to something that now all countries in the world are called upon to take into action. And we need to understand what is significant about this issue and why we need to address it exactly. So, to start with, what is violence against women in politics? It is a distinct form of violence that exists at the crossroads of political or electoral violence and gender-based violence. It's violence that attacks women either because they are women specifically, or that attacks them in specifically gendered forms and ways or in disproportionate ways. There's no shortage of examples of this, obviously. We're familiar with it. Anything from women in Zimbabwe experiencing female genital mutilation in retaliation for the exercise of their civil and political rights, to legislatures across Western democracies as well who are denouncing sexual harassment through the Me Too campaigns and otherwise, to incidents like the tragic bombing of a busload of female election workers in Afghanistan some years ago. The victims of this form of violence are certainly women in politics, but they're broader than that as well. They extend to female voters, female journalists, women who are registering to vote for the first time, who are participating in civil society activities, who are educating their communities, and likewise, as well as the staffs of those political women. Perpetrators are not the perpetrators that we often just associate with election violence, but they're also including family members, people who are related to or connected to the target of the violence. It's a form of violence that's not only physical violence, which is what we commonly think of when we talk about political violence, but it's also sexual, and most importantly, it's psychological as well. And it occurs in many spaces. It occurs in public spaces, it occurs in private spaces, and most significantly to our talk today, it occurs in online spaces. And it's this issue of online spaces for the violence against women in politics that we've come to talk about this afternoon, because there are some really distinct factors about cyberspace, social media, that make it particularly treacherous for women, especially women who are exercising their rights to vote, to be elected, and to otherwise participate in the governance of their countries. So what is it about cyberspace that makes it so dangerous, perhaps, or so open to abuse and misuse in this space? The basic answer is that violence against women in politics is overwhelmingly psycho and psychological in nature, and that the internet itself is custom made for this type of violence, which is what women are particularly experiencing. The attacks that occur in these online spaces, morality-based attacks, attacks that are accusing women of prostitution, of being bad mothers, of being bad wives, that are distorting their faces and their narratives. This is made to measure for these online spaces. So I'll offer to you 5 distinct ways that social media is particularly risky for women who are working in these spaces. So first of all, because of the nature of social media, it is open to ridicule, it is open to shaming, it is open to distorting women's narratives and stories, which is the single most prominent form of violence against women in politics, whether online or offline. Second of all, because increasingly over the past 10 years since this issue has been recognized, the importance of images is also really dominant in this space. We talk to female parliamentarians around the world who say they are constantly seeing themselves being photoshopped, they are seeing inappropriate photos taken, either direct physically photos or photos of them, in inappropriate, or faces or things that are used across the web to shame them and to humiliate them, and to mock them on the basis of their gender for their participation. Third is the uncontrollable speed that these attacks take place at. Politics, elections is a fast-moving space, and the speed at which information is traveling through the internet has a huge impact on how damaging it can be for the women involved. Well before police can get involved or other things, in many cases, the damage is often done. Which is connected to the fourth factor, which is the issue of redress for this. It is incredibly challenging to respond to these things that are taking place in such great volumes in cases where the perpetrator cannot be identified, where anonymity is such a factor, which is connected also, of course, to the last factor, which is the issue of impunity for these issues, which our colleagues will be talking about. it is an incredibly challenging space to regulate and to identify and deal with perpetrators in. So this is the challenge of what's going on with this violence against women in politics in online spaces. We see through our research at IFEST that internet technology, social media, and private communication technologies are sometimes used for direct threats. So threats against women who are being threatened with physical or sexual violence. But again, overwhelmingly, it's about shaming, degrading, insulting, humiliating, and driving women out of this political space. Our current research is working with a social media analytics tool using sentiment analysis to gauge the conversation around the world on women in politics. We've currently worked on it in the Ukraine, Zimbabwe, and in Sri Lanka, and are going forward in other countries as well, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. And we're finding there that women in some of these countries are targeted with online threats, degrading attacks, and other forms of digital harassment at up to 3 times the rate of their male counterparts. The attacks largely reflect anger with women's decision to run for office or to otherwise engage in public affairs because they're breaking with traditional gender roles. And the content of this vitriol, whether it is in Zimbabwe or the Ukraine or elsewhere, is riddled with sexual threats, manipulated images and videos, and direct threats of physical harm. So what do we do about it? To wrap up, for us, the first step is to document it. Tools like the tools that we're implementing with IFEST, with sentiment analysis and elsewise, are helping understand what is happening online, how big is this problem, how fast is it spreading, who does it target, and how is it a distinctly gendered form of violence. And it is a tool that we recognize applies to virtually all contexts around the world, even though the shape and the face of this violence does vary according to the region and the country. Second response, we need to intervene directly and work to protect the victims and work to make the internet a more safe space for all to participate in. My colleague, Dr. Thakur, will be talking about this. And thirdly, and very importantly, we need to be ending impunity for this issue, as our further colleagues will be discussing. As long as we are failing to recognize violence against women in politics when it occurs and to prosecute its perpetrators, the permissive norms and the attitudes and behaviors that allow it to occur will continue. So what I'd like you to take away here is that violence against women in politics is not only a manifestation of inequality or harm against an individual, but it's also a mechanism that is formally institutionalizing women's subordinate position in society, and it coercively excludes them from the governance of state institutions. It's a vicious cycle that keeps women out of the political spaces where they would be able to make decisions that could end this type of violence and other violences in the future. Just as it is an attack on the individual victim of this violence, it's also a way to undermine democracy and to enforce this patriarchal control of democratic institutions that is a fundamental form of inequality. So it's for this reason that we believe that talking about violence against women in politics, understanding how particularly treacherous online spaces can be about it, and understanding the solutions to dealing with it are particularly important for us to talk about today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Gabrielle. So I would like to just follow up with a few key points based on the research that we've been doing at the Web Foundation. The Web Foundation, first of all, was an organization started by Tim Berners-Lee. He's the person that actually created the web. And this week actually marks the 30th anniversary of the creation of the World Wide Web, which I think it's particularly important given the timing of this panel and what has happened over the last 30 years when the web was created as a tool to empower people, to promote greater equality, and the way it has been evolved today to promote many bad behaviors, as it were, including harassment and abuse of women online, and including women politicians. So the Web Foundation focuses on digital equality, generally speaking, and we conduct a lot of research on issues around access, but also on women's rights online. We have a program called Women's Rights Online, which consists of about 15 different NGOs, women's groups across the world that are focused on these issues. One thing I'd like to start with, and perhaps a somewhat different angle, is the issue around access. Today, as we know, you look at in many countries and globally, women are less likely to use the internet than men. Now, if you consider the benefits of using social media or the internet generally, for example, for political parties and political representatives, and consider the fact that women are less likely to use it, then you can see that they are less likely to also benefit or promote their agendas politically as well. In our research that looked at urban populations in low-income communities across 10 countries, we found that women were 50% less likely to use the internet than men. The Economist Intelligence Unit today says that globally, women are 25% less likely to use the internet than men. There are many factors behind this, but what we have found in our research is one of them being the trauma and the threat of harassment online. When you look at the incidence of online harassment, generally speaking, women are more likely to face this, as Gabrielle was mentioning, face this problem online. But it varies across different regions, obviously. So, for example, going back to that international survey research I mentioned, we found that in some cities, for example, in Kampala and Nairobi in East Africa, it could be as many as 45% of respondents in the surveys in Uganda would report experiencing online harassment. And as a result, many of them suggested that that level, that threat often prevented them from using the internet effectively. It restricted what they could do online. These are some of the problems that we need to recognize when we're talking about the effectiveness of using the internet and these kinds of tools in political participation. One other point I'd mention, though, even when we think about political participation, there are biases or problems there. In our research, we found that typically, and I think this is something that many people recognize, women face many additional barriers to participate in political life, many more so than men. When it talks about using online tools, internet, social media, to engage in political participation, whether it is in civic life or political life, in political elections and so on, women are less likely to do so because they have to overcome these barriers in the offline world, in the real world, as it were. And there are many kinds of barriers in terms of like physical violence, threats, and so on. After overcoming those, they come to an online space where they have additional barriers relative to men. And these create, the end result then is the effect that you see men more likely to use these tools to promote themselves in political parties, political organizations, civic life, and so on. The point about, so you see the point then about understand the relationships between access and the potential for online harassment. The UNHCR actually commented that this gender gap that I mentioned between men and women's access to the internet is actually a consequence and cause of the violations of women's human rights. So I think it's key to remember that connection. I also briefly, I just want to talk about some of the work that our partners have done on this issue through the Women's Rights Online Network. One is, for example, from our partner, the Women of Uganda Network, based in Uganda. One of the things they have pointed out is even when we have laws or policies in place to theoretically protect people's presence or activities online, protect them against harassment and things like that, the problem is in the enforcement of these laws, the lack of capacity within judicial systems to actually enforce these laws, but also within law enforcement. One of the key arguments that this group, the Women of Uganda Network, has pointed out is that because of that lack of enforcement, because of that lack of capacity, these laws become quite ineffective. And I mentioned earlier how in our survey in Uganda a couple of years ago, as many as 45% of women reported online harassment as being one of the factors that prevent them from effectively using the internet. Another example is from Cameroon, our partner there, Internet Sans Frontières, points out the issue around privacy and data protection. Now, This is something that we should also be concerned about. When we talk about the ability for people to use the internet safely and effectively, we should also be concerned about privacy. Many governments have loopholes in these so-called cyber policies or cybercrime laws that allow governments or other their agencies to surveil citizens. Women in particular can be vulnerable to these kinds of loopholes and targets, and that translates into additional barriers for them to participate online, and that also has implications for political participation online. Finally, I want to bring up a point from Jamaica, where even when we have these laws in place, they can often be perverted to be used against women's participation. So there is a cybercrime law in place in Jamaica, which was designed in part to protect people's participation online, so prevent abuse and harassment. However, what had happened in a particular case was that some activists had raised or accused certain men of sexual harassing other women, and the activists had presented this information online. The government used the law, the same law, to argue that this person had defamed these men and should therefore be arrested under the letter of that particular law. The case was actually thrown out in the end, but it shows, and it's an example how although these laws were put in place to protect people online, they were actually used in a perverse way to prevent freedom of speech, and particularly targeted at women. So I'll end there for now, and we can maybe continue in the Q&A afterwards. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you. Well, thank you, and many thanks to Gabrielle for extending the invitation to both myself and Kim to be here. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today and speak about these important issues during CSW. Our research really started just over 5 years ago, and we started to look at gender-based issues online quite broadly, and then we kind of thought we narrowed it down to online violence against women, and we are far from really narrowing it down. It's a huge issue, which keeps us going research-wise. So we're delighted to be here today to share with you some of our thoughts from just over past 5 years, I guess. Don't worry, I won't be speaking for too long. Our research really, at this point in time, focuses on online violence against women and examination of legal responses to this particularly global phenomenon. Although we are both based in the UK, we do keep quite an international perspective on it as well, which takes a lot of time, believe it or not. So I hope we can be sort of as concrete as possible here. Our approach really, having researched this for over 5 years, is quite holistic. We advocate for quite a holistic approach to tackling online violence against women. And what we mean by that is that, well, firstly, law is an important tool, but it's not the only tool towards tackling online violence against women. And within that, of course, I include online violence against women in politics. Within law, which is nonetheless an important tool, we need to look beyond merely focusing on one particular area of the law. So, for instance, there is a huge tendency to sort of criminalize everything and just look straight to criminal law for answers. This tends to be quite difficult in practice. So I think what we would advocate for is actually look at all legal tools that are at your disposal, be it domestic, regional, international law, but also various areas of the law, criminal, civil, and including also human rights perspective on the issue. We cannot really avoid the communications perspective here. I think whenever we're talking about online violence against women, we do tend to focus very selectively on certain issues. However, social media abuse and online abuse is happening in internet sphere, in online environments, and also particularly looking at text-based abuse. So, for example, abusive tweets that are directed at women, particularly in context of politics, are methods of using sort of online communication. So we also have laws that govern this type of communications. And there is no reason why we should not have a gender perspective on it. And this is something I think we both feel very strongly about. So this is sort of our holistic approach. But although we're discussing violence against women in politics today, I think it's very important that we know that online violence against women affects women generally. Not only those women who are politicians, but or who have very public profile or who advocate for typically feminist issues. Although experiences, of course, of online violence against women can be quite different, depending on the context, depending on the issues involved, they do have, sadly, a unifying feature, and this feature is the silencing effect that it's got on women. This is something that Gabrielle mentioned also in her remarks. And as Danaraj mentioned, this very much has the aim and the effect of driving women away from the online sphere. And particularly in context of our research, I think driving women away from social media. Now, we all know our lives are increasingly happening online. I'm pretty sure everybody today has done something online, which was not just emailing or messaging. Am I correct? I think so. Me too. So sort of online presence and presence on social media, increasingly so, is not only needed, but expected of those who want to be heard in the public sphere. The public sphere is no longer constrained to sort of town halls and small gatherings offline, just like we're streaming online right now. But it is required in order to participate in public life, in order to have very public presence. So any obstacles to that raise a broader issue of equality of participation in public sphere in 2019 and in the future. This, of course, includes, but is not limited to politics. And in our view, equality of participation, particularly online, is a necessary element of any democratic society and is particularly necessary from perspective of equal participation. Now, in this context, online violence against women is one single biggest threat to actually ensuring women's participation online and, by extension, ensuring gender equality. As we are reminded by the UN Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, in Article 7, there is an obligation actually on all states who are parties to that convention to ensure and to take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the political and public life. Now, I think in 2019, there is nothing really more public than actually being online and putting your views out there, be it political views or otherwise. However, also the prevalent nature of online violence against women exemplifies the widespread and the everyday nature of violence against women generally. I know we've spent, I think, decades bringing this to attention at both domestic and international levels. Now we're also bringing it to attention in context of online environments. It also sadly serves us as a reminder, and a sad reminder, how truly little has changed in terms of public attitudes towards women, be it offline or online. And despite the prevalence of the issue of online violence against women in politics, the responses have really been few and not very satisfactory, both at domestic and international levels. Very often, any efforts to combat online violence against women are met with a response that this unfortunately can't be done because there are freedom of expression rights. And again, this is something we, I think, feel very strongly about in a way that both rights should not be perceived as against one another. They are not in competition with one another. They are actually self-reinforcing and mutually reinforcing. I think we would go in so far as argue that we can't have freedom of expression for all without gender equality, and vice versa. Of course, as Gabrielle mentioned at the very beginning, we've seen some developments at the UN and international level, particularly from the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and then the UN General Assembly resolution in the latter part of last year. However, although these steps are very much appreciated, and I think the time is long overdue for us to bring these issues to an international domain, much more really needs to be done in order to ensure a multi-actor response, both at international and domestic levels. And most of all, I think this issue needs to be tackled from a variety of angles, including human rights law, communications laws, and let's not forget, also education.
Yeah, so just to kind of follow up on that point, as Olga has already said, we take a holistic view towards tackling the problem. And part of the problem is defining exactly what we mean when we talk about online violence against women, be it in a political context or not. And certainly within the UK and within Europe, there is a complete lack of understanding of what this behaviour is and how we define that, certainly within the legal system. There is no clear-cut definition of this form of behaviour. The UK Parliament and various committees have considered what this kind of behaviour might amount to, and at various points in time have decided that actually they don't want a definition, they just want a list of different behaviours. And that list runs certainly to a very lengthy paragraph, if not beyond more than one paragraph. And that as a starting point is fine, because it's recognition of the problem. But when it comes to the law, what we actually need are very specific behaviours in which the law can then tackle in order to bring about a change. And whilst we don't think law is the starting point, and it shouldn't be the only thing tackling this, actually the law plays a very prominent role in allowing us to talk about certain kinds of behaviour and address those behaviours in a very specific manner, which should then, in theory, lead to a sea change of behaviour and in turn change social norms, which should make the internet a safe place for all to actually express what they want to express, rather than playing it safe so that they don't have to actually deal with the fallout from any opinions which might be slightly contentious. Several high-profile, prominent female politicians in the UK have fallen into that trap in the last 18 months or so. Diane Abbott, in particular, from the Labour Party, has been the victim of horrendous amounts of online abuse, just for daring to express opinions which some people might disagree with, but actually the opinions are not the problem. The backlash is because of the characteristics that are attached to those people. She's not the only one. There are other Jewish politicians who've been the victim of huge amounts of anti-Semitic abuse. Similarly, there have been more regional leaders, both in Scotland and in Wales, who've been abused because of their particular nationalities, just for being Scottish and expressing an opinion about actually what should be good for Scotland. The same in Wales. And so within all of that, actually, there is a gender dimension to it, but the dimensions go beyond gender. Yes, it's violence against women, but it's not just violence against women for being women. It's violence against women for being women and expressing opinions based on other associated factors. And those factors do not appear in the law. They are not protected in any way. They are very rarely commented on. It's certainly a non-issue as far as the UK legal system is concerned, and actually the same at a European level. There is no recognition of the other factors which are playing a role in the level of abuse which people get. So the law really, if I'm being particularly critical, and I am, lags way behind. It should have done better, and it hasn't. It's been entirely ignorant of the nature of the gendered harms. It's also, if I'm being brutally honest, entirely ignorant of the meaning of the harm that we're talking about here in terms of psychological harm, but also economic harm in making yourself kind of less present online and having to move and deal with the fallout, making yourself secure and safe and dealing with the context of the family, if there is one, in terms of the abuse and the threats which are carried out as well. So none of that is factored into the legal provisions which we currently talk about. There's no recognition. There is no significant judicial recognition of these kinds of harms in the context of online violence against women, specifically in a political context, and that too is a failing of the legal system. It should be doing better. This is not a new issue, it's a new dimension, but the underlying issues actually are much more historical, and we've just completely conveniently ignored them, overlooked them, and moved on. And that brings me to where I'm going to get really ranty, the communications provisions, particularly in the UK legal system. There is a complete absence of cybercrime considerations when it comes to violence against women online, particularly violence against women in a political sphere. In England and Wales in particular, we don't talk about this in the context of cybercrime. We don't actually talk about it really in the context of crime. We don't regard it as a criminal issue. To the extent that there is legal regulation, we think about it in terms of the misuse of a communications network. So somebody who is trolling and being abusive on Twitter is just misusing Twitter. But I mean, you can't really have criminal sanctions attached to that, certainly as far as the legal system's concerned. So how do we address it? Well, in short, actually, we tend not to. We tend to ignore it. We tend to overlook it. We tend to say, oh no, it's too difficult to prosecute this, so we just won't bother. We'll move on. It's not really harmful. It just happens online. And that attitude is part part of the reinforcement of the fact that actually it's acceptable to carry out this behaviour online, and it really, really gets both of us going across the board. The law can do better, it should do better. The police should also do better. When prominent politicians have highlighted that they've been subjected to this abuse and reported that on Twitter to the police response has been, oh, no, you need to come into the police station and report it in person, or you need to pick up the phone and report it over the phone. We can't deal with a report of this abuse via Twitter. And actually, when this happened with Stella Creasy, the only time the threats, which were rape and death threats, were taken seriously is when a hand cut out letter, like a traditional threatening letter, was sent to her physically. That then became an issue which the police were interested in. Until that point, all of the Twitter abuse, completely irrelevant, wasn't something that the police were going to act on. And that just highlights the lunacy of the system that we have, whereby there is an establishment of actually, no, we're not going to take this seriously. But then when you go back to old school paper, which, is not necessarily the biggest form of threat now, no, that's entirely fine. We can deal with that because we know what we're dealing with in that context. And of course, there are bigger questions, right? There are questions about whether or not the platforms should have responsibility in this context. And the UK has thought about this to some extent, but not a particularly great deal. There have been suggestions that we have an online safety charter which platforms should sign up to. There have been suggestions that users take greater responsibility, and that's fine, but the users are actually the ones who are carrying out these behaviours, and the platforms are empowering them by allowing it to happen and not acting on the abuse and the threats when they are sent. And they don't act. If there is a terrorist issue, then the content is taken down practically immediately because of the European context in which fines will then follow if they don't act. When it comes to individuals who are receiving hundreds of thousands of threatening and abusive messages, the same responses do not happen. And it can be abusive messages which are online for weeks before anything is done about taking down that content. And actually, even when a decision is made, the moderators tend to say, oh no, it's fine, it doesn't violate the rules, so it's just going to stay there for a bit longer. There have been at least 3 significant reports in the last year in the UK alone, thinking about how we deal with the internet and transparency and accountability and platform regulation. I wish I could say any one of them was good enough in terms of addressing the problem. None of them are, largely because we're stuck in this situation where we have liability shields for the platforms. So as long as they don't play an active role in hosting the content and they've not actually provided the content, it's not their problem if the content is online or not. And the same actually applies in the US context, albeit in a slightly different way. So the legal system actually accepts that there is a lack of responsibility by these platforms. They are almost entirely unregulable in some contexts, and that is part of what has to change in order to allow us to tackle these problems going forward. So in terms of what we would like to see, well, we'd like to see a greater focus on the gendered harms first and foremost. We'd also like to see the law take the issue seriously. We'd like to see international leadership on platform accountability and regulation. Because of the nature of these platforms and their global reach, it's not just an issue for national legal systems to address. And if we try and do that, then we'll get into sticky territory in terms of whose internet is the safest, whose internet is the best protected. And that's not going to help anybody, especially when it comes to dealing with violence against women and the threats which are made. There must therefore be tangible and adequate frameworks for the 21st century, nationally and internationally, but also legally and beyond the law. Rights are rights, and they should be for everybody. And the law has a role to play in protecting those rights, but the law is not the end solution. It's just a starting point, but it can be a force for good. And I will leave it there.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I think just to sort of summarize some of the threads that came up, we sort of heard a little bit from Gabrielle and Olga and Kim about what sort of the definitions that we might have of violence against women in politics or violence against women online might be, but that at the national level this may not be reflected adequately, if at all, in law. And so there's a gap between sort of some of our maybe theoretical understandings of what this means or international understandings and what it means at the national level, and then sort of how you move forward with implementation in that case. We heard a lot about how women face barriers to participate in political life generally in real life, and that then this sort of online hostile context can just create another set of barriers that make sort of political engagement and political life just seem like something that is not something that everyone wants to pursue when you may be facing shame, ridicule, threats, harassment, threats to your family, a whole sort of battery of horrible things when you turn on your computer. We heard cases and findings from the UK, which was frankly fairly depressing. Thank you for that. Uganda, Cameroon, Jamaica, Gabrielle's examples from Zimbabwe and Sri Lanka. And so it really just sort of becomes clear, I think, that this is a global problem, that the actual manifestations may be slightly different in every country context, but what does unite many women's experience online is the potential, if not the actuality of harassment, whether they are politically active or not, unfortunately. We heard a little bit about this issue of not just that there may not be laws in place to respond to these issues, but that even when there are laws in place, they may not be enforced, that law enforcement agencies may also themselves just not have the right sort of attitude, frankly, about enforcing these laws, and that in some cases the laws are used against the people who ostensibly they are meant to protect. And so there's this sort of other issue of, the theory and then the practice where there is a legal framework in place. Another sort of thread that I think came up was this idea that, another way to put it, of sort of balancing rights, that in some cases rights like freedom of expression or right to privacy can actually be used to argue against protecting women. And so how do you find this balance where freedom of expression really is for everyone, and that means creating a safe space if we want to protect the online public square as sort of the cornerstone of democracy in the 21st century and beyond. And then I think finally there were common threads around the fact that it's not just going to be a legal response that is needed. It's going to be a legal response first at the national and international and regional levels, but also other actions that are taken by civil society, others, to sort of keep this conversation going and start really affecting the changes that we need at the sort of the local level and the sort of normative social and cultural level. So I think we've heard a lot today. I'd be interested to see if anyone has any questions yes. Yay, we love questions. Please.
Thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. I'm here with Liberal International, which is actually the World Federation of Liberal and Democratic Progressive Political Parties. And for us, this issue has been very much at the forefront. We've actually worked a lot with the Special Rapporteur and the National Democratic Institute to drive this issue among our membership. And this is my question: how do we engage political parties on this issue? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about talking to civil society and to the public in general. It's actually engaging the actors that provide those platforms to these women. Of course, you have women who run independently, but very often women run on a political party platform. So how do we engage parties to make sure that they not only address this issue, but support their candidates when they encounter violence, be it physical, be it online violence, of course? And then what role do you see for political internationals, such as Liberal International? I hate to say it, but we are the only ones that I've seen so far that really take ownership of this issue and responsibility and kind of drive the issue internally. So how can we engage the rest of the political internationals, the Socialist International, the International Democratic Union, and so forth, to really make this issue not just something that's being discussed here, but also among their own political families and parties.
Thank you. Great question. Maybe we can take 3 questions and then I can open it to the panel. Yes.
Thank you. My name is August. I'm 19 years old. I'm from the University of Bridgeport, and I studied global political economy and diplomacy. Back home in South Africa, or where I'm originally from, the leading opposing political party, there was a female there, and she received ridicule and attacks from even within the parliament, and as a result she has left. And me as a political aspirant, I aspire to be president in future. People ask me, are you ready for the backlash that will come forth? And I'm like, why do I even have to anticipate it? And you guys have mentioned the legislation. And my question is, in the future when legislation is made, how can we simplify that process? Because I don't want to be going to court, talking to people. I want to do my job as president. I want to do my job and whatever vision I have as a president. How is that legislative process broken down and simplified so that it doesn't distract me from doing my actual job?
Thank you. One more question.
Yes. My name is Leslie Wright, and I'm from Santa International. And I attended a session at I think it was at the Japan Society a few years ago during CSW, where I think a presentation was presented by I want to say Glassdoor. You're nodding your head, so maybe you.
I don't know if it was
also.
Glassdoor, but I was at the same event.
Yeah, but at any rate, what I wanted to say that I was particularly touched by at that presentation was the fact that the online violence against women in politics also came across national borders. So this woman from the UK was presenting, and she pointed out that the online violence that she was getting was coming from the United States. And I think that that's particularly insidious. And I also think that it's important from a legal perspective to be able to try to identify where these things are coming from. And when you find that they can come from all over and bounce off of different, I'm not sure what the term is, but bounce off of different areas of the towers or what have you, then it makes it much more difficult to track and to find out where things are, to be able to prosecute or at least somehow hold accountable those people who are creating these situations. But I do think that it's really hard for women in politics in particular if they're being bombarded by people from some other country. That it's one thing to get negative impact from your own countrymen, but it's quite another to get it from someplace else where it's totally irrelevant and inappropriate. I wonder if the panel wanted to comment on that.
Thank you. So I will just reiterate the questions, open it to the panel, and then we'll come back for some more questions. So we had 3 questions. One was sort of how do we engage political parties on this issue, either I guess maybe at the sort of country level or at the international level where we have conglomerations of parties. The second question was sort of how do we simplify legislative processes to address these issues so we're not distracted. And then the third question is, what do we do, or how can you get redress or remedy when harassment can kind of be global in nature, coming from across country lines? So does anybody want to go first? Have things particularly jump out at them? Gabrielle, you did this, so
I'm very excited by all of these questions. I might start with the last in terms of the national borders, because this is something that we've also been noticing. So in our research using this online sentiment analysis tool, which is looking at publicly available data on a variety of social media platforms worldwide, the geography issue has been certainly one of great importance, and there's multiple levels to it. First of all, this violent rhetoric is coming out of the capital cities for the most part, because that's where the internet is, that's where the resources are and all of that access. But we believe that it folds out in different ways through media in particular that are capturing the nature of the content emanating from the kind of wealthy nuts in the big cities, and then taking it out into more traditional media forms. We notice a lot of this connected to diaspora populations around the world, which we can only speculate as to the causes of that, but part of it might be related to the distance that is between it, because the greater distance between you and the victim, the more likely you are to engage in abusive behaviors. And thirdly, we see this in the Ukraine. Part of this is part of the promotion of autocratic behaviors. We see a very, very high level of violence against women in politics online directed at Ukrainian politicians coming from Russia. And this is very intentional because by promoting intolerance, promoting sexism, misogyny, any type of form of intolerance, this is promoting the values that are connected to authoritarian rule and that break down democracy. So by attacking women, by attacking other minority and vulnerable populations, this becomes a tool for authoritarian regimes to achieve their greater goals, which is overall attacking the human rights system. So geography is very important. It's a very complex issue. I don't want to take up too much time. I'll reply really briefly to the political parties question as well, because I think it's related to your question, as well as about how to simplify this. We're not going to be able to capture the full scale of this through measurement things. It is so big. The dimensions of it are so complex because it's not just about incident reporting and, going after prosecuting every individual case of it. But we recognize that cases are very symbolic. Women go viral more often than men in our research. We believe this is due to the fact that when women violate some type of traditional standard of morality, it tends to be more shocking than when men do the same thing online. And shock value is what makes things go viral. So women are vulnerable to going viral, but then when you prosecute those cases, they have a greater symbolic importance as well. So what we've done in Zimbabwe, for example, is working with a combination of actors, with police who stated their commitment to prosecuting these crimes, with associations of women lawyers, Zimbabwean women lawyers, to train them on what is this issue, what is violence against women in politics, what is online violence, what does it look like, how does all of the different aspects of the legal structure respond to it, and what can they do. And by selecting a few cases that did go viral and where the victims the survivors were wanting to take it to the courts, which is another big issue that we haven't talked about, the demand side for this. We were able to see a few cases go through the legal system and become prosecuted, which we hope will provoke further change and attitudinal change and simplify the system. Anyway, I'll stop talking now.
Other thoughts, responses to questions?
Yeah. So, in terms of how we simplify legislation when it's made, talk to the experts. Politicians, no disrespect to any of them, tend to confuse the situation with their own particular stance on it. And so actually when we talk about legislation which is effective and enforceable, what we need are very clear terms and very clear thresholds for evidence and what the standards are that have to be met. The friendly fire issue is one, I think, more of social norms than law. I don't think we'd want to see law imposing social norms on people. That said, somebody's got to stand up and be counted and put themselves out there as leading the change. And that takes bravery in this particular context because there is going to be a backlash. I wish I could tell you there wouldn't be a backlash, but there will be. But hopefully if enough people talk about it at a global level and it becomes sufficiently serious enough issue that most people understand the pernicious harm attached to it, then actually there will be a change. And that in turn should lead to simplified legislative processes. The International Human Rights Committee and organisations could lead on that if they wanted to and set benchmarks, but that's perhaps a pipe dream at the moment. In terms of the cross-border point, yep, it's a huge issue, and legally it's also a huge issue, which is why actually the platform should play a particular role and have accountability and responsibility for dealing with some of it. Quite often the police will say it's a resourcing issue. They won't be able to find the evidence and track it down, and actually that's why the platform should stand up and be counted and take a stance on this and deal with it when it's reported to them. They actually have probably the easiest job in terms of taking down the content and dealing with the perpetrators, but quite often they're just not interested in responding to it because of the volume that there is to deal with.
But also I think it draws upon the point that I think you made earlier about the need to recognize, firstly, that this behavior is harmful and that gendered abuse online is harmful, be it in context of politics, of course, then other factors are at play, but more generally. And I think I was very struck by your question when I think in the latter part you said, what can be done so I'm not distracted from doing my job? Now, I'm afraid that law with all its procedures I don't think we will have kind of accountability like that. I think there needs to be due process and measures as well. By the way, I'm not using due process as a sort of, blanket towards sort of lack of accountability, quite to the opposite. So I'm afraid as far as the legal solutions are concerned, it is bureaucratic, but this is not to say that we should not have good laws in place. Because if we, and I don't say it lightly, we cannot put everything just to education and to soft law measures. If that was the case, we would also quite happily give up sort of laws on, murder. I mean, everybody knows that we should not murder people, but nonetheless we think it's, a thing to legislate for. But perhaps to take a bit sort of lighter approach in context of online environment. We legislate quite happily in context of other activities that we undertake online. I mean, online banking is the example that we quote through and through, or other forms of particularly economic activity online. We don't hear sort of much opposition to this kind of regulation, but because we recognize that there is a harm included when things go wrong. So I think the underlying argument here is that we actually need to see greater recognition of gendered online harms. But coming back to your point about, I'm glad to hear that you'll be running for president. If I had voting rights, then in these countries I would vote for you. But I think it's also quite important when we're talking about violence against women in politics to not only talk about the situation now, but to look possibly at women who perhaps are teenagers today, who maybe one day would like to enter politics. And here it comes to a broader issue that we can't talk only about online violence against women in politics. We need to talk about online violence against women. Because, and I'm very glad that, I think you're quite resilient from what I gather, but I think it is unfair to sort of expect all girls that are subjected, or young women who are subjected to abuse online, to have the same resilience and to kind of bear it. I think we need to stand up for it and sort of call it out for what it is. It is a gendered form of abuse. It does happen online, and it can be remedied. And we need to have laws as well as other measures that can address these situations. Also, I think for the future.
Thank you. Anna, should you want to respond?
Yeah, just to maybe pick up on what you just said, and going back to the question around raising awareness on this issue on political parties. I think looking back at our own experiences through the Web Foundation and our research, one of the things that we realize is that many politicians, policymakers do not even recognize that this is a problem in the first place. This is what you're hinting at. So the problem from a policy solution point of view, if the policymakers themselves do not even think that this is an issue, then we have a problem there. So that as a starting point, it is important to get them to realize that there's a problem. The underlying problem there is that most of these people are men. And men are in most of these cases are perpetrators of these issues, and in part do not recognize therefore that this is a big issue. So in trying to tackle the problem, that problem comes from men is part of the underlying issue that we have to get at here. How to tackle that often comes down to an individual kind of understanding, a kind of self-reflection process that men have to go through to realize that we are part of the problem, and that this problem is immense and huge, and creating essentially blocking like half of the population to effectively live the way they want and participate in the politics the way they want to. I'll give an example that when we look at policies generally that within the ICT, within the technology space, they often exclude any consideration of factors around women and gender. So whether that deals with online violence or access or any other or dimensions of these kinds of policies as well, which means that they are not addressing any of these problems. In trying to engage policymakers more, we have tried to talk directly with them to try and raise awareness about these issues, but this often comes down to kind of individual conversation. It's very complex. There's no simple solution here. It's not as if you can just get a bunch of people into a room and run a workshop and suddenly they're enlightened about what these problems are.
That would be great.
That would be great, right. So that's what I'm saying. That from my own experience, I've seen where, for example, I've done research around looking at why certain countries, in certain countries, why the policies are not gender responsive enough, which is the term we use. And in engaging some of these male policymakers in that kind of interview process, they come to realize that, hey, there are problems here. But that is a very slow, cumbersome process if you think of it as going from policymaker to policymaker. But I think it has to start around that and to recognize that the problem is with many men.
Thank you. Next round of questions, somebody back.
Thank you. I'm called Eunice. I come from Uganda. I came in with the document talking about what you've done. Online harassment, especially against
female political leaders in Uganda is real. But I don't know whether you know in Uganda. There is this excitement on social media in Uganda. Actually, from your submissions, I wanted to know what are the limitations of violence against women using social media. Because like in my country, women deliberately go online and, for instance, let me give the latest, something which is very common with the member of Parliament. She went to the media and said she's single, and she's one of these beautiful young MPs of Parliament. And one of the young boys started sending her messages asking her for a hand in marriage. But this is a boy who was still in secondary school. And the lady had to took the case to court, and they arrested the boy. Now the people who were telling her that she's violating the rights of the boy were fellow women who were even in Parliament. And some men were with her, telling her it is her right to protect herself. But even people were telling her, you then went on social media, use the media, and told people that you're single, you were looking for a man. Now, the other issue, we have several ladies, they come online and maybe they choose to be naked. And so they will control the social media discussions for almost a month. Then, before the discussion ends, she's saying, I'm going to stand for a member of Parliament for this place. Now, what are the limitations of abuse? When do you create resilience? When do you protect yourself? And who knows that it's being abused? Even the victims of abuse don't know that they're victims. Even the perpetrators don't know that they're even abusing anybody. Because if I wake up in the morning and I undress and I put my picture on social media, who is abusing who? So can we talk about that discussion? How are we supposed to be using social media to assume that we are using it within the dynamics of using it for development or something? And what we post on social media, how is it used? Is it, for example, in my culture, it is a taboo is what the women know what. For me to expose my privacy publicly. So you're abusing my rights if I look at you naked on social media. Now, but again, if I use that very picture to haunt you, you'll say that I'm using the very platform to abuse you. So who's doing what? I think that dilemma must be discussed.
Thank you. Another question?
Yeah. So a couple of things I wanted to touch on in terms of law and maybe how far we've come in some spheres. You know, there was a time, somebody mentioned it's become a private matter. The law enforcement looks at it as private, somehow not the public sphere in terms of being able to use the law in prosecution to deal with harassment. So not so long ago in this country, it was domestic violence was a private matter in most jurisdictions, where if a woman was not bringing charges against being beaten in her own home, the husband or the boyfriend wouldn't be prosecuted. But we have, evolved legally and socially to understand that domestic violence of any kind is a crime against the state. It's a crime against society, and that the state must act, because we know that if the state doesn't act, that there will be impunity and it will send the wrong message. So, this is, in our short lifetime, this has changed. I think on these platforms, I know that Twitter does have terms of use. I know that they do have terms of use, and they do take down posts. But it's interesting to see what they consider to be violations of their terms. So I guess I'm using both of those to say I think that progress can be made to assert what are forms of abuse. And I think I'd be very interested to see the research that you have about how this is being caught, how this is sort of being categorized as abuse, and how it's being generated, and how you can track it. I did have a larger point that I wanted to ask in terms of you mentioned that it's mostly men who are conducting the abuse online, or even the use of online is proportionately male. as a mother of a 14-year-old and a 26-year-old, both who have been, the older one's been through the gauntlet, the younger one's going through the gauntlet of online life. In gaming, in particular, there is a huge amount of misogyny. But you know, the other big problem for men online and boys online, which is creating this mental infrastructure of our culture, is something like a third of boys by the age of 12 are exposed to very violent pornography. And I wonder how, and you know, it's not something that most adults who work in this field really know about, because it's not, you know, your father's pornography. It's extremely violent that they come across. And I just wondered if that has been part of your research in terms of looking at the environments of the internet and the web, and how that's affecting the attitudes towards women and girls in terms of online life for males who are the largely the perpetrators here.
Thank you. At the far back, and then we'll respond, and then maybe, I think we even have time for a final round after that.
Hi. Thank you so much for hosting this. I had a quick question about millennial politicians, because I was curious about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, you know, she's been attacked on social media relentlessly, and I know that there was a video of her dancing, which is something that, you know, isn't so out of the ordinary, right? But you have these people that disagree with her politics, that are creating these unreasonable expectations for women in politics based on this idea, you know, because they disagree with them, they're looking for something to disagree with. So I wanted to know, how do you, what does your research say about people that grew up in the internet age, where, you know, things from their high school are now, you know, on online records? And how do you encourage, and how does your research go into the advocacy mode in encouraging young women, especially young women of the internet age, to get involved with this when there are these unreasonable expectations on them?
Thank you. So 3 questions again. The first one was sort of, I think, around the individual responsibility of people who are posting online, and sort of where their responsibility and their rights, sort of where that line is. Then the second question was about whether or not research or work has really looked at the sort of broader environment of the internet, and how maybe sort of other less savory aspects of the internet impacts attitudes towards women and girls who are active online. And then the third question was about sort of the right to be forgotten online, and how can you ever get rid of anything that you've ever put up online, and how do we encourage young women to participate in public life when this environment exists for them. So.
Go in a different order this time?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Are you ready? Do you have
Yeah, I don't have answer to a particular question, so I've got a couple of reflections, I think, on some themes that are coming up from that. So firstly, on private and public divide and how certain issues are portrayed, I think you're right in terms of, I think that goes for more broadly addressing violence against women. I think we're getting there in terms of the acknowledgement that violence against women is a public issue. It's not just a private issue. But I take your point that historically it did take a lot of effort, a lot of advocacy, a lot of legal reform to get where we are, and still we are not quite there yet in many other jurisdictions. But I think that also speaks to the point of kind of blaming women for sort of how they participate online, or maybe they put too much content online or the wrong type of content. And it always sort of brings back the kind of, I guess, 80s, 70s, 80s debates of like, well, she got raped because she wore too short skirt. Well, why do you go out at night? Why do you walk on the street at night? So it's, again, shedding the responsibility towards a victim rather than perpetrator. So we tend to have this, I think I speak as a society, not everybody, of course, but there is a sort of existing tendency to kind of focus on the person to whom the harm was caused rather than the harm itself and the perpetrator of the harm. Of course, we need to read things in context. It can't be sort of isolated from it. But I think something has gone somewhere very wrong, that it took us many years to acknowledge sort of the public nature of certain acts and kind of move away from sort of blaming women for essentially being abused. And now that we're considering these issues online, we're back in time to so many of these debates. I think something has quite gone wrong here. And that brings me, I think, to the point about sort of social media and internet and how we participate. And I think that was the first question. And I think it strikes me that actually, I think we need to take a step back and sort of ask, well, there are the same, who is causing these harms and where? It's the same people, but the environment is different. So the certain behaviors, certain attitudes, certain stereotypes that we as members of society carry with us and express have migrated online. So it's not the case that the internet has come along and out of a sudden it's this evil that has, you know, took over us and we are turning into bad people and doing all these horrific things online. Actually, perhaps we need to reflect upon ourselves and as societies and think, well, perhaps there are deeper underlying issues here, structural issues that we need to address in context of more generally gender stereotypes, gender-based violence, structural violence, that we need to consider first these underlying issues rather than sort of jumping to the internet and the online environment and blaming it for some sort of, I don't know, evil behaviors. I think that's the wrong way around. So I guess what I'm saying is that we are transferring certain pre-existing behaviors, certain prejudices from our offline world into online. So perhaps what we're talking about is not that different, it's just the environment in which it's taking place has kind of shifted to a more global, more accessible, more public in a way. So I'll leave it here. I'll let others speak.
So I think to take it back to games, because that was my, I guess, first love in a legal regulatory context. Yeah, you're right. There is a huge amount of very violent behaviour online, which young boys in particular are exposed to very early on. We've not looked at that specifically in our research. Our research is on a different focus, but I know there are people in the UK that are looking at the connections between very violent pornography and very violent games and attitudes towards women more broadly. And from what I know of their research, in a nutshell, what they say is that it becomes addictive for those boys and men playing those games, and the more addicted they get to it, the more that attitude transfers offline. And actually, when they start taking a step back from it, they suddenly realise that they have almost developed a completely different personality, because you transform when you're in those environments in order to fit into those environments. And kind of where we started was talking about women in games.
Yes.
And how that problem was manifesting itself in misogyny and the problems that causes. And actually what we've seen, given that games are now more mainstream and social media is more mainstream, it's a transference of game behaviours into the online social media context. So I'm not blaming games specifically.
Or social media.
Or social media.
Or the internet.
But I think the structural point is kind of the key to this, and the norms and the behaviours that we have online are very much things that are more throwaway because they're online. We don't have to necessarily think about it in the same way that we think about it in an offline context. I assume most of us would be less offensive in the street than we might be online because it's easier, there's a knee-jerk reaction. And so some of the debate that we need to have goes beyond actually legal regulation and whose fault it is and which platform is at fault. And some of it is just norms and the behaviours and the norms and actually exposure to other behaviours which might make you stop and think. And that again goes back to structure and hierarchy and some of the historical problems which actually we haven't addressed, we've just allowed to expand to different forms of engagement.
Thank you. Are there last thoughts on this? We have one more question, then I think we have to wrap up. Yeah, time has flown. It's a good sign.
Just a very quick one. I think the questions that were raised are good for good indicative questions of further research that's needed here. But on the point about exposure, particularly young boys, to different kinds of content online, I think generally and this goes back to a particular study we did in Jamaica, the exposure to these kinds of things desensitize people to what they can share or what they should be sharing online. And so part of the problem here is that people often just share pictures, videos, explicit content of women without their consent. And that has implications in terms of what happens to them, right? In terms of harm to them. People become very used to sharing these kinds of things because they think it's like normal. And in fact, this was one of the findings from that particular study. I would suspect that this is linked to this idea that the more extreme content you see, other kinds of content, maybe just a simple photograph or whatever is considered not a big deal, and that could be related to that. So just a comment.
And yeah, just a very brief response. These are great questions. Your suggestions on further research paths are definitely taken to heart. Not a specific response, but just the collective questions inspired a comment. You know, the survivors and the victims of this are not just the individuals involved, and it's not just the broader society, democracy. It's also the families and the people that surround these people. I mean, we talk to the staff members of political representatives who are the frontline people dealing with this. They're feeling traumatized by the content. We're dealing with the researchers that we work with on our sentiment analysis, I was saying earlier. In many cases, we're facing real difficulty because they simply don't want to engage with this really filthy, disturbing, destructive content, men or women. In other cases where we're trying to analyze the content of visual things, we had a comment just last week. The group we want to work with wants to do it, but they work in an open office environment, and they simply can't have this graphic imagery on the screens in the work environment because it traumatizes their colleagues. And in particular, one case of the president of the Electoral Commission of Bosnia-Herzegovina, who's also a board member of IFEST, she was attacked online through deep fake pornography on YouTube, vicious and filthy, based on her role as a prominent figure. And in that case, you know, the immediate reaction is to delete the content, obviously. She is not a millennial, and so she turned to her millennial son for help removing that content, which then of course exposes the son to that type of content about his mother. And the rest of the family raises concern, well-meaning concern with husbands and others as well, about this political participation. So it has a ripple effect across that space. And you ask, you know, what is different with the millennial politicians and activists in this space? And I would say the response is particularly in the response to that violence. I think the millennial generation is able to respond to this type of a thing more effectively, to use the internet as a rallying tool to change behaviors, to react in real time, and to drive corrective responses to it. So that's where I see a rate.
So I want to come back to our final question, and then any very quick last thoughts, because we only have like 5 minutes left, I'm afraid.
My name is Sheila Katzman. I'm the chair for New York City, CDON, president of the International Association for Women in Radio and Television. I really am moved by what I heard, even though we came in a little bit late. It's clear to me that all that's been revealed, and kind of nothing new to me personally, seemed to go back to the boardrooms of major media, social media platform. We look at Twitter, we look at Facebook, etc. And as a journalist, we do have a lot of our journalists that have come under fire across the globe. All right, we have one journalist whose husband was hacked to death in Bangladesh, and she lost her fingers for the Panama Papers. She lived a sanctuary in some unknown place in the United States. I'm listening to all of you, and I'm saying, this is a socio-mental problem. Have you ever really thought of that? It seemed to be a socio-mental problem, and what the lady brought up about your son, possibly could be exposed to real violent pornography, which creates change personality and create a kind of a loneliness. Because I'm just wondering if any normal human being, could be doing the things that, and thanks for bringing up my cousin Diane, right? Because Diane is going through a lot in the UK, right? From she ran for head of the Labour Party when I was there, and even at the very interviews, it was just so horrible what's going on with women in politics, to journalists, to women in general around the world. And I think you brought up Article 7 of CEDAW. I think the bit of gender inequality plays a great role and impacts us all negatively. and how do we engage, how do you engage us as the media? We need protection too, in a sense, but how do you work with the media when you're doing these kinds of research? I'm from Jamaica.
I hear you.
This kind of research to bring media practitioners into this kind of a discussion and debate, which would really make these reports stronger. Reports with action.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we have just a few minutes left. I would just ask if you have very short responses to that question, last reflections before we close. Who wants to go first? Gabrielle. You made eye contact. It's a fatal mistake.
Well, no, I would first of all just like to start by saying thank you to our excellent moderator and to the colleagues on the panel, because I've learned a tremendous amount from you, and I'm really inspired by the work you're doing in leading this space. A final remark, the role of media is essential in defining what is and what isn't tolerable in a society, and how those notions are depicted. And so, again, the most powerful way I have seen to date of convincing people of just how ugly this is by interacting with it and seeing what it looks like in firsthand. It's very upsetting, but once you see it once, you get the point. Which might be a bit of a dramatic statement, but there it is. I think that this is a field that is evolving at lightning speed. Violence against women in politics is a crime against the state, it's a crime against society, it's a crime against democracy. It's only been 6 months since it was recognized as a human rights violation. Likewise for online hate speech. I think just in the past few years we're realizing that internet freedom is both about freedom of expression but also freedom from this type of hateful thing. So things are changing really quickly, but we need to be conscious of how it expresses itself in gendered ways and how the different aspects of responding to it can respond to all of those gendered aspects as well. So thank you. And just a really last comment. We couldn't have a sign-in sheet here, but if anyone would like to receive further information from all of us about this, please see my colleague Liz at the exit here. We'd be happy to take your cards or your emails to share information with. Thank you.
Last thoughts, Dhanraj?
Yeah, I also want to say thanks to Abraham and Gabrielle and everyone and the audience for the questions that we had. It was a very good discussion. I think there's still a lot more work to be done, especially going back to the point I made earlier about on the policy side of it. Policymakers, governments are just not really aware of this problem and are therefore not doing enough. And so we need to raise awareness at that particular level, and that's a job that everyone can be involved with, whether it's the media, journalists, civil society groups, and everyone else, to push for more change at that level as well. Yeah.
Final reflections.
Final reflections. Let's blame Mark Zuckerberg and Jack. Right? They are partially responsible. We all have responsibility to not be idiots and to not be abusive online, right? And we can all be idiotic and we can all be abusive, but actually stop and think before we tweet it. And I think if we are all role models, that in turn will expand to our networks, and that in turn will lead to a shift in social norms, and at the same time will push all of the relevant players at a governmental level and beyond. But actually the responsibility is not just with them, it's with the users as well. And that's a bit we can't ignore when we talk about these issues.
Yeah, I think we mentioned CEDAW. I mean, we are in close proximity to the UN. We are in New York. So it would be rude not to kind of say, and I mean it as a serious comment, we need to utilize all tools we've got in place at this point in time. I mean, you know, CEDAW's been around since 1979. That's before we were talking about Twitter and this kind of abuse. Yet we are still coming back to same issues, but now online. But we can still utilize these tools, monitoring mechanisms, reporting mechanisms at international level to at least start the conversation of how global the problem of online violence against women is and how global online violence against women in politics everywhere is. So I would say start from here. Maybe convince the US to be a to ratify CEDAW. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly.
So that would be a nice thing. I think speaking sort of from the European perspective, Council of Europe perspective, we do have Istanbul Convention, which is a convention on violence against women, on combating violence against women and domestic violence. And within that, there is a particular article that has been largely underused, I think, but it places also responsibility on states in context of that convention to work within the media sector, to have these conversations. I think it hasn't been utilized enough in context of online violence against women. I think it should be. This is something we're also working on. And on your final point, how do we make it happen? I don't know. Let's talk. Let's talk further. I think we're in for a long game here. So let's talk and make it happen. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for spending your time with us this afternoon. Thank you to our online audience too, and please join me in a round of applause for our panelists.